Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to the Interior Speculations 1 conference. Perhaps we'll give a few minutes, maybe 2 more minutes, for people to join in, and we will start in a second. Perfect. So again, welcome everyone to the Interior Speculations 1 conference. I am Manuel Macia. I'm a lecturer in interior architecture and design at Nottingham University. I'm part of the interior architecture and design team. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the session today. I would like to welcome you to this event, also on behalf of the interior architecture and design team. So I'm going to give you the structure of the event today, which is the following. After my initial introduction and housekeeping notes, I will hand over to Harry Foley for a presentation titled Things in Fields and Other Spaces, Social Histories of the Car Boot Sale, followed by a 20-minute Q&A. The presentation will then be followed by 2 presentations from interior architecture and design students here at NTU, Olivia Witcomb and Kang, and followed by a 20-minute Q&A. I will then hand over to our keynote speaker, Professor Iain Borden, followed by a 20-minute Q&A as well. And finally, I will finish the session with a few closing remarks. So historically, notions of interiority have been subject to use across a wide variety of disciplines, including sociology, psychiatry, and architecture. Despite systematic efforts to dissect the latter into more distinct divisions of labor, practitioners and researchers continue to speculate on the variegated role of the interior in the architectural field and the extent of its influence on a swath of other related discourses. In this spirit, as interior architecture and design at NTU continues to evolve from its modest origin, the inaugural Interior Speculations Research Conference provides an accessible environment for the free exchange of ideas and scholarly works that aim to explore the tensions between practice and research in debates on the evolution of the contemporary interior. Some housekeeping notes before we proceed. First, please be aware that this event is being recorded. So by joining the meeting, you are consenting to be recorded. If you wish to remain anonymous, please keep your video off and your sound muted. Second is you are invited to keep your video on during the event, but please stay muted unless invited to speak. The third is note that during the Q&A sessions, you can submit questions using the live event Q&A little icon on the top right-hand side of your screen. And alternatively, you can ask the questions or share your comments by selecting the raise hand option, if that's a possibility. If not, then use the Q&A, the live Q&A option. Good. So before we start, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Harry Foley. Harry Foley is a RIBA accredited architectural designer with years of experience as a practitioner in New York, Beijing, and London. This part of his career culminated with a role as a designer on the Royal Opera House Open Up scheme for Sterling Prize-winning practice Stanton Williams. Since leaving architectural practice, Harry has received his master's degree in architectural history from the Bartlett, University College London in 2019. He is now co-course leader for the BA Hons Interior Architecture and Design program here at Nottingham University, and he is also completing his PhD in Architectural and Urban History and Theory at the Bartlett, University College London. His talk today is titled Things in Fields and Other Spaces, Social Histories of the Car Boot Sale. I hand over to Harry Foley.
Great, thanks very much, Manuel. What an introduction. I'm just going to share my screen now then, guys. So just bear with me 1 second. Is everybody able to see this? Okay. I'm not quite yet.
Yes.
Let me just go into full screen mode. Just that out of the way. Okay, that's great. Okay, so yeah, as Manuel's
the screen's black, Harry. Sorry to interrupt you.
Sorry. What did you say? Sorry, Mama.
The screen looks black. The whole screen right now.
Oh, okay. Let me just come out of full screen. Is that better?
That's better, yeah.
Okay. I'll just try full screen one more time. If it doesn't work, just let me know, and we can just stick with it as it is. How is it now? Is that better or no?
No, we can still see the screen with the Adobe Acrobat application.
Okay, fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just stick with it as it is then.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Well, as Manuel stipulated there, this talk is entitled Things in Fields and Other Spaces, and that is a reference to a great architectural critic from the 60s and 70s, Iain Nairn. And also it refers to social histories of the car boot sale, but architectural histories will come into play as well. So this is something that I'm working on currently as part of my PhD studies. And I just want to kind of share with you, I suppose, what I've been up to with that so far. So just, yeah, very briefly, Manuel's kind of summed it up really, but in terms of my own background, as he's mentioned there, a few years experience working in practice, used to work for Stanton Williams, and now carrying out my PhD in architectural and urban history and theory over at the Bartlett at UCL. So one of the things that came apparent with the MA in architectural history was I was studying a number of different critics, and Iain Nairn was one that stood out. So just speaking about the car boot sale to begin with, largely this transpired as a later byproduct from a number of cultural and technological developments, all of which have their roots in an optimistic post-war Britain. As such, the car boot sale is absent from studies of suburbia that found popularity in the 1950s, including Outrage, a special issue for the Architectural Review, edited by a young Iain Nairn, a fringe figure of the angry young men, but only Nairn was really angry. It's now considered to be one of the pinnacles of architectural publishing. This work hallmarked Nairn's famed polemic concerning the proliferation of automobile ownership in the 1950s, with a particular disdain for the physical impacts this had upon the suburban vernacular. In order to demonstrate these types of effects, with the help of Gordon Cullen, the renowned architect and AR art editor, Nairn plotted a car journey from Southampton to Carlisle, almost a straight line across the country, perhaps an old habit from the critics' RAF days. This excursion manifested as a route map, forming a precursor to the main sections of Outrage, this architectural review issue, each part referring to one of the highlighted locations, all of which concerned a specific town or suburban village for cross-examination. Invariably, discussion centered on the physical appearance of things, material culture responding to growing car use at the time, that Nairn accused of embodying the homogenization of Britain. So the types of things that he would refer to are things, really mundane items such as road signs and bollards and advertising boards, and even down to likes of poorly pruned trees. But in the early 1970s, the car boot sale became one of these things, impacting significantly on the physical condition of the suburban landscape, and as such is also deserving of proper acknowledgement, discussion and documentation in a formal historical context. Disguised, however, by the notional crease of Nairn's fold-out roadmap and otherwise omitted from Histories to Follow, the car boot sale remains a vital cultural artifact that is yet to be thoroughly explored from an academic perspective. So whilst Nairn had this kind of a love-hate relationship with the car, public consent was leaning increasingly towards a love for car journeys at the time. So this owed perhaps to an increasing emphasis on the possibilities permitted by the automobile, particularly the hatchback car, for which ownership soared throughout the 1960s and 1970s. The Citroën Diane is one example, a 5-door hatchback car that emphasized an exciting lifestyle of outdoor pursuits through a cleverly tailored advertising campaign. So we have to remember this is a period that saw the rise of advertising and marketing companies, and that had a real impact on the way people felt about themselves and about the objects they surrounded themselves with. So also one of the things about these hatchback models was that they allowed additional storage, which allowed for things that was dubbed by these advertising marketing companies mini adventures to the countryside, capturing the public imagination at the time. Despite its newfound popularity, however, the car had already begun to be discussed by intellectuals and academics. Freud, for example, insinuates connections to the domestic interior by describing the car as accessory organ, an exoskeleton or a traveling whelk shell from which, in safety, to contemplate the surrounding monsters, an extension of home. There were a lot of critics of the automobile as well, though, particularly in the late 60s and 70s, as it's begun to rise in popularity. So French philosophers such as Henri Lefebvre accused the car of colonizing everyday life with geometric space of traffic circulation and parking spaces. Guy Debord and the Situationists International also point to the car as a catalyzing instrument for cities and suburbia to be transformed into highly controlled environments. So this picks up once again on some of the themes apparent in Nairn's Outrage, a kind of homogeneous treatment of the built environment that is heavily responsive to technology, but less concerned by craft, intuition, and imagination. So as a result of the emergence of these advertising and marketing companies during this period, there came a proliferation in ownership of material things as well, especially for the home. So changing consumer attitudes were reflected in the work of architects and designers such as the Smithsons, whose put-away house on the left-hand side here, proposal made storage take center stage, and other typical functions associated with the home were moved to ancillary spaces surrounding this area. Artists of the period also acknowledged this newfound taste for material possessions and how embedded meaning played a role in allowing individuals to project images of themselves onto others. So a combined response to a newfound love for the automobile and to this kind of mini crisis of burgeoning things in the home interior, the car boot sale arrived to the UK in the 1970s as a leisurely fundraising activity, mainly organised by local churches. The weekly event, now occurring typically every Sunday, proliferated dramatically in the late 1980s and 1990s, a quintessentially postmodern consumption site, one which synthesizes leisure with consumption. It's a weekly event that sellers drive to, where they pay a flat rate fee to the promoter or organizer for the pitch, on which they park the car and from which they sell their goods, mostly arranged on kind of self-provided, do-it-yourself wallpapering or decorating tables of a style that you get in any kind of DIY store. So many of the sellers are individuals, families, and less frequently groups of friends just trying to move on unwanted household or personal items. Others, however, are commercial traders, market traders, and in some cases retailers, some of whom use the car boot sale to dispose of counterfeit, knockoff, and or stolen goods. The grid-like approach to designing the car boot sale, however, does allude to a more refined planning process than is commonly experienced in these sites at table level. So it's important in some respects to theoretically remove oneself from the site in order to build a fuller understanding of the ways in which it operates. It's worth drawing attention to the fact that when viewed in this kind of format, the car boot sale is almost reminiscent of simple sort of urban planning exercises with dedicated spaces to buy and sell, to socialize, spaces to eat, and spaces for leisure, etc. Numerous conditions are made by the organisers of these events, as explained by Tracy Hodgson, organiser of Battersea Boot in London, including time of arrival, number of vehicles, the size and types of vehicles, types of sellers, etc. Informed by some of these factors, the price and size of pitches is manipulated, which throws another variable into the mix. So So all of these strict measures are necessary in order to adhere to the grid-based system that is applied to the site to help ensure smooth running and regulation of the event, but also permits the kind of organized chaos of these events to which we are perhaps more commonly accustomed. But this attitude to planning the weekly event pervades the lives of those who attend it. Those that frequent the car boot sale use familiar patterns to their advantage. In the context of the car boot sale, the booter embraces an active, performative role as part of a specific ecology of movement and timing. Together with a fluid vendor-buyer relationship, highly variable pricing mechanisms, and a tacit acceptance of the risk involved with buying a bargain or a dud, years of repetition for the booter combine to create an individual that is knowledgeable and skilled in this arena. Most evidently, this is demonstrated in the construction of one theatrical act, rare in most other forms of consumption, but central in the case of the car boot sale, the act of haggling. Embedded in this repetition are forms of tacit knowledge, such as that related to haggling, that serve to dispel some of the unpredictable or unexpected qualities of the car boot sale. So to quote Michel de Certeau, here in this environment, the booter applies their own tactics, their own creations, and their own initiatives, though as de Certeau would claim, most everyday practices are tactical in character anyway. So shaped by their actions, this is a transgressive space constructed through theatre, performance, spectacle, and laughter. Historically, though, the car boot sale has encountered innumerable confrontations with local planning authorities, particularly during the 1990s, where this was most covered. This might be partly due to the fact that the nature of the car boot sale had changed during this period, becoming unrecognisable as a charitable event. Whilst more of the British landscape became subject to a process of monetisation to host the car boot sale, so too complaints to local authorities increased. In 1995, for example, amidst the height of the phenomenon's public popularity, a 50% sample of British local authorities revealed that 150 applications for directions controlling land use, the bulk of which explicitly sought to control car boot sales. These local authorities referred to the Town and Country Planning Act at the time, which sought to control all UK development, subjecting it to planning permission. But by the 1990s, this requirement had been drastically amended with a rolling series of general development orders, so advised that GDOs must not be withdrawn without compelling reasons or without evidence of a specific threat. Local authorities were forced to allow changes, rendering certain classes of development exempt from the conventional rules, which were referred to henceforth as permitted developments. The term permitted development also generally allows for the temporary or intermittent use of lands from requiring planning permission. Yet some classes of development may be brought back under control if a specific threat is demonstrated, but this only occurs under exceptional circumstances. However, in the 1990s, it was acknowledged by politicians and legal practitioners alike that directions could be used specifically to control the growth of the car boot sale. Thus, a planning tool was used to control the informal, episodic use of land, a morally questionable approach considering the bulk of complaints concerned law enforcement issues. As a result, local planning authorities, mostly comprised of the articulate middle classes, were accused by academics such as Peter Larkham of cultivating further manifestations of NIMBYism, or a sort of not in my backyard approach. On these issues, Tracy Hobson, the organizer of Battersea Boot, explains, we're sometimes given a year of temporary permission, sometimes 2 or 3 years. Despite operating for over 20 years now, we still do not have permanent permission to operate. But for the first time since commencing the events, Tracy feels confident that attitudes towards the car boot sale are gradually changing. So as the world pushes for a more sustainable future and consumer attitudes have shifted dramatically, the demographic and general feeling towards the car boot sale has become much more democratic. In a society that has become more conscious of its impact on the earth, people are increasingly hopeful of extending the usable life of their possessions. But what is that extended life of the objects concerned, and how are they now consumed? So whilst contemporary life remains littered by objects for now, new sites emerge alongside the car boot sale to offer relief and become the subject of academic scrutiny. So Emma Philippidis' study of domestic self-storage units, for example, interprets such units as extended spatialities of the home with the ability to alter domestic living patterns. The car boot cell may also be viewed as an extended spatiality to the home, or as a kind of interstitial site connecting the home to other spaces through these material objects. But the objects concerned in this sense become vessels providing psychological links between the home, the car boot cell, and various other sites. It would seem pertinent then to contribute to an established history and study of material culture by recording and tracing a number of objects from the car boot cell. But insinuated by the previous images, the manner in which we consume material things has changed dramatically since the success of the car boot cell in the 1990s. So a site that was once catalyzed by technological advances is now undergoing something of a demise at the hand of the same provocation. This research will attempt to understand the extent of the effects of online consumption, including the ways in which this may impact domestic life. So the images that we have here that have been slightly changed, of course, these show the interior spaces in the home of a regular bootist, someone who goes to the car boot on a regular basis. And we can see on the left-hand side, this is somebody who collects gold for their own benefits, just as a kind of collector, I suppose. But what they do in the image on the left-hand side, just on top of the hubs, they explained, is that they will examine the gold that they buy at the car boot sale, usually in bulk, in bags, some of which is real, some of which is fake. But this is where they will start to kind of, I suppose, separate the wheat from the chaff. And what they might do is take the gold link of a real gold chain and put it onto the end of a fake gold chain, because anyone who knows about gold knows that typically the stamp for gold is on the link itself. So if you have a nice kind of heavy fake gold chain and you stick the link of a real gold chain on the end, then you're getting a lot of money for that weight in gold. So little things like this, I suppose, which start to infiltrate the home, start to impact, as you can see, quite significantly on the way these people live. And similarly, on the right-hand side there, we can see this is the second bedroom, and it's absolutely filled with items ready to be sold online, but also some items which have already been put into envelopes ready to go. So in summary, that was a very quick kind of fly through some of the research that I've been doing so far, but obviously it's in its infancy at the moment. This is my first year carrying out this PhD, but in summary, I suppose discussion concerning interior space is really a necessity in order to build a full understanding of the car boot cell, as this is an architectural site that has been established and that has grown and fluctuated in response to the interior and our own behaviours in these interiors, especially domestic space. But it does concern domestic interiors, a conventional retail environment, or even marketplaces such as Scunthorpe Market, pictured here. And there I am, sat behind the market stall. This is my parents' market stall in Scunthorpe. Hence, I suppose, the interest initially in car boot cells. But I think that's everything from me, guys. I think I may have run over slightly, but I'll hand it back to Manuel, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry, for this really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I wanted to first ask if there are any questions in the live event Q&A tab. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask them in the Q&A tab, and I will read them for Harry to answer. So in the meantime, while everyone gathers their questions, I do have a few questions, and I hope I don't take a lot of time, because there's a lot of stuff here to unpack. And I wanted to ask you, Harry, about the notion of, the extended organs that you explored at the beginning through Freud. I found that to be absolutely fascinating, how the car can become a bit of an extended organ in a sense, according to Freud, and that made me think of the media theory of the 70s, in a way, like the McLuhan's idea that media are the extensions of the body, and so on and so forth. So anyway, like that kind of idea of an extended organ, how would you think about that in the present, especially in relation to spatiality, to this extended spatiality that you mentioned before? I think it's a bit of an open-ended question.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, really interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, the kinds of things that Freud is referring to, I suppose, at the time. I mean, it's something that kind of changes from one period to the next. I mean, when we think about the way in which UK cities started to follow suit with the US and how they started to design and attach garages, for example, onto the sides of their homes, and this was initially, I suppose, obviously to house this kind of influx of cars and this kind of desire that people had to own a car of their own. But eventually, as I kind of shown in those final images there, I suppose, other material objects started to infiltrate these spaces too. And so it's these spaces that continuously change in terms of the way we use these. And I think now in present day, I mean, it's starting more and more in terms of kind of ongoing academic research. There's more attention being given, obviously, to virtual spaces and even things like kind of video game environments and this type of stuff. You know, it's really kind of flexible, and there's no real limit, I suppose, to the ways in which you can interpret these things. But yeah, I guess in relation to the car boot cell, it's just seen, as I say, a kind of interstitial site, something which is kind of operating in between all these other spaces. And historically, maybe this is why they tend to feature in fields, in farmlands for the most part, things that we see as sort of in the periphery of everyday life. If we're traveling down motorways, for example, these fields and things surrounding us, we don't really pay much attention to any of these things. And I guess that alludes to the kind of illicit nature sometimes of the car boot sale as well. So yeah, I don't know if that really answers anything, but
yeah, totally. Let's see if there are any questions. Are there any questions on the Q&A bit? Okay, there's the public is a bit shy. If no one wants to ask any other questions, maybe I will kind of follow up with what you just said and perhaps ask you a bit more about haggling. I think that's such an interesting concept, isn't it? Because not only it works as a kind of a key practice that configures this counter economy of the car boot sale, but it also has, I believe, like theoretical or methodological consequences, right? I'm kind of trying to think about what we do in research, in a sense. If we can think of a type of methodological haggling in a way, what do we do? What are all these kind of creative and / illicit moves that allow us to think about things in a new way or in a different way? And I wonder if that's something that you're considering as well within your own research.
Well, I mean, you know, not quite as yet, but I mean, haggling is really interesting in this. I mean, you could write a short essay just about the process of haggling car boot sales and the kind of implications that this has. Because I guess coming back to the kind of thing about Freud and this idea of being a kind of in a protected bubble to an extent to experience the outside world, haggling is one of those kind of instruments at the car boot sale which has a really huge impact on the way people feel about this space. You know, people feel vulnerable to an extent, I suppose, because it's not a traditional retail environment where the price is there, you pay for it and you go home. This is something which requires practice, almost an expertise, and that's kind of what I'm referring to, I suppose, in relation to the booter. You know, it takes time to build up these skills, and it's something that maybe the public, to an extent, sometimes can be unwilling to do, and perhaps that's maybe alluding to, again, this you know, the increasing amount of kind of TV shows and this type of thing that we see as well, like kind of, you know, what is it, like bargain hunts and kind of celebrity booty and these types of things. You know, people want to experience these things in safety, as Freud might put it, from their homes, and without really kind of exposing themselves to too much risk, because essentially that's what going to the car boot sale is all about. It's all about kind of risk taking, and in order to kind of make those stats or make the odds kind of lie in your favor, it requires time and it requires practice. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Harry. I think that question of practice will haunt us today after your presentation. I think that, you know, that like haggling as kind of a social phenomenon, as a type of social production, is really, really key and really interesting. Let me ask if there are any questions in the Q&A bit just before we move on. There's one question here. Okay, there's a question. from Sam, and Sam is asking, will the historical geometry of the car boot dissolve with new consumer types and behaviors, referencing the changing sustainable attitudes of consumers?
Well, I don't know if it will change. I don't know if it will change the geometry so much of these spaces. I mean, in terms of if we're talking spatially in terms of the way these sites are planned, I mean, they really respond obviously to the automobile. You know, these sites have been designed to accommodate these types of vehicles and allowing a little bit of space each time. And the amount of space that each person, each attendee to the car boot is afforded is dependent on the size of the vehicle and the amount of money that they pay. And sometimes, as a kind of gesture, I suppose, from the organizers, if it's people that go on a regular basis. But I suppose, you know, we're talking about sustainability. As I mentioned there in the presentation, I think it's starting to pick up and starting to affect the amount of people that are going to these types of sites, because people are much more conscious about what they purchase now and the kind of the full life cycle of the objects that they buy, including things like clothing and furniture. And I think that these types of sites are going to see a lot more footfall in coming years, and because retail, for sure, obviously, even with COVID and everything as well now, is really starting to struggle. So I think these sites are really going to pick up, and that's kind of indicated through talking to some of the organizers. They start to see this kind of trend, and these, you know, eco warriors, I suppose, to an extent as well, coming to these sites and really starting to take part, and much younger generations especially, which is going to be good for the longevity of these sites too.
Brilliant. So there's another question in the chat that says, by an anonymous attendant, and it says, I was interested in what you said about the decisions made on the day by the organizers of the car boot sale. What is the relationship between the design of the space, quite open, and its performativity to accommodate what comes? It feels like the design of these places follows a lot what happens shortly before and during the event, changing its architecture.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I suppose they're kind of responsive events to an extent. I mean, because, and this is kind of the beauty of these types of sites, you don't really know what to expect to a certain extent. I mean, these things are planned quite meticulously beforehand, but actually, again, referring to kind of people who regularly attend these events, they will tell you themselves that even though these kind of lanes are set up for them to pass down and to go from one lane to the next, people very rarely follow these paths that are laid out for them. So it's a kind of almost, yeah, a kind of situationist international or kind of, you know, Michel de Certeau kind of approach in a sense, you know, referring to like the Guy Debord's Derive. People will kind of use their intuition, especially if they go to these sites on a regular basis. And I think despite how these things are organized, people will kind of do their own thing at the end of the day. People will like to kind of follow their own pursuits and have specific things that they're looking for at these sites, whether they're actually looking to buy anything or just going to socialize or to eat or whatever. There, as I kind of mentioned, in terms of the similarities to like the urban planning, these things provide lots of different activities and people will go for different things. So I think you can only plan these sites to a certain extent before it becomes defunct, to be honest.
Thank you, Ari. There's another question here by another anonymous attendant, and it says, I'm interested in the subversive element. Can these events still be viewed as subversive counterculture, or have they become more mainstream now?
Well, yeah, that's again something that came out through discussion with one of the organizers of the boot sales I've been looking at as well, actually. And yeah, I mean, originally these things started out as a much more kind of working class affair, just kind of charitable fundraising events. But actually, as I mentioned there, they're starting to allude to the fact that these things are much more diverse these days. You know, it's much more diverse demographic they're going to these sites, and particularly a growing younger generation, a younger audience going to these things as well. Fashion students and kind of people who are environmentally concerned, people who want to kind of pick up items for not much money, basically, but also people from middle class backgrounds who go and see the benefits of selling at these sites, not just financially, but again, for the environment. So sustainability is really a driving factor for these sites these days. And it's something that everyone, I think, is becoming really concerned with. So yeah, in terms of, you know, who these spaces are for these days, it's really incredibly diverse, actually, and far more representative of wider society.
Thank you very much, Harry. Are there any other questions in the chat? Does anyone else want to ask a final question, perhaps, before we move on? No? Brilliant. Thank you, Harry. That was a really, really interesting presentation. And yeah, thank you very much for everything. Now we're going to move to the next presentation, and I'm going to introduce our next speakers. They are Olivia Witcomb and Kang. They are two of our brilliant students in the final year in interior architecture and design at Nottingham Trent University. And Olivia will give us a talk that is titled "The Role of Design and Nottingham's Skating Community." And I will introduce the next speaker after Olivia. So I hand over to you, Olivia.
Amazing, thank you. Let me just share my screen. Just as what Harry was doing before, can you see this if I go into full screen mode?
Works perfectly.
Okay, fab. Right, so my chosen research topic that I'll be running through with you today is the role of design in Nottingham's skating community. So why skateboarding and urban design? Over the first national lockdown, when everyone was sort of picking up new hobbies and redoing their driveways, I was attempting to teach myself the art of skateboarding. This fueled interest in the topic, yet due to my little knowledge of the community, it allowed me to conduct the research with little to no bias. Research themes seen throughout my project include subculture, Nottingham skateboarding world and its historical DIY skate scene, representation, views of the public, the importance of skateboarding within an urban setting, and the extent to which urban design can better cater to the community. Why is this research relevant? Considering Nottingham's rich skateboarding history, which dates back to the late 20th century and includes the first ever hosting of a UK skateboarding festival, the community still faces issues such as skate stoppers, no skate zones, and primarily a poor reputation. In terms of the aims of my project, they were to identify the extent to which urban design and landscape architecture can better cater to the needs of the skating community, to develop an understanding of the community's needs and way of life, helping to identify what they require from society in order to thrive within it, to understand what is currently provided for the community, assessing the success of these implementations, and finally to acknowledge an understanding of how the skating community wish to be represented. Methodology. So during my research, my primary location was Centre Market Square in Nottingham. Here I conducted an ethnographic study supported by secondary research and a literature review over a sort of 4-month timescale. Methods included observations, semi-structured interviews, in-person and via video call, online surveys, photography, sketching and computerised illustration. For those of you who don't know what an ethnographic study is, it's sort of research into a specific community or culture, or better spoken by James Bradley as something that says, I want to understand the world from your point of view. I want to know what you know in the way you know it. I want to understand the meaning of your experience, to walk in your shoes, to feel things as you feel them, to explain things as you explain them. Will you become my teacher and help me understand? So why urban design? To the right, I have some illustrations of the main forms of skateboarding transitions, and I suppose what a lot of people would sort of relate most to skateboarding. However, when sort of observing some of these urban landscapes where skaters tended to congregate, none of these were recorded. That's because there's an important difference between park skating and urban skating, one being in a skate park environment and the other in urban. So I think this is important because skating was birthed in the 1940s, establishing itself off the back of the California surf culture. This transition to skateboarding catalysed from, as Borden says, surfers exploring new utopian ideas of urban environments, treating urban terrain as waves, the body mirroring surfing's familiar movements. I think this sort of justifies the reason why urban design is so relevant, and that's because it provides a skater with a landscape that simulates the true movements of skateboarding and sort of therefore provides back to that more traditional side of the community. Sneinton Market skate scene. So Sneinton Market Square was designed by Patel Taylor in 2012. Despite it finding a name for itself within the community, Sneinton Market is a no skate zone. So how is this such a prominent skate spot? Location, it is within Nottingham city centre and therefore is easily accessible, as well as the fact that most skate spaces, as I'm pretty sure, is the same within a lot of cities, such as skate box, being moved to the edges of cities, sort of out of sight, out of mind. One skater also expressed her love for Sneinton as it has the most European style community in Nottingham, saying they're very welcoming of the status here, proving local acceptance to be of great value to the community. So positive representation, this is sort of a key theme that runs throughout my research, especially when relating back to subculture and stigmas highlighted within my literature review. I just wanted to sort of go through a main observation that I saw that sort of shows this poor representation, which can be seen to the right of an illustration that I drew of what was termed, or of whom was termed, the youth, who also make use of the space. They often leave litter and sort of play loud music, etc. But as this is sort of the skaters' safe place, and it also becomes a bit of like their home, not only does this sort of feel like they disrespect the space, but it also means that when public arrive to or walk through the space, predominantly police, it means that they get blamed for it, and therefore not only does this bring poor representation, which is unjustified, but it also means that sometimes they get asked to leave or they're just more hot on that area, which obviously is not great for the community. When starting my project, I sort of conducted a questionnaire of which 81.8% of skaters agreed on the need for positive implementation in Nottingham to help with representation of the community. They also highlighted stigmas including relation to drugs, vandalism and delinquency. Just to sort of highlight the sort of perhaps reasoning why stigmas aren't necessarily true, Ross Henfler in his book on subcultures sort of implies that it is in fact changes and experiences had within their environment that perhaps cause behaviours such as deviance, relating it to disadvantaged areas, and therefore sort of rather than it being skateboarding itself, of which gets the bulk of all the stigmas, it is perhaps due to the environment. Here is an example I've done where I've illustrated one of SCOB Architect's 3 urban public spaces in Barcelona. They aim to merge communal public space and skate parks with the intention of harbouring social interactions between people of different backgrounds and bring positive exposure to the skateboarding community through learning and communicating. This is sort of a key theme also throughout that sort of states that this is probably the best way to do something where you can get people to just talk and communicate and understand each other, and therefore that sort of misjudgment of stigmas previously spoken about is avoided. So what skating provides to both the skater and the city. In terms of the skater, it helps to catalyse creativity, personal expression and social interaction. I think this is one of my favourite observations that I did throughout my research, of which sort of shows how the skaters view urban landscape perhaps different to somebody who hasn't skated before. It's almost like they manipulate the space with more of a creative eye, and therefore, for example, on the right I have an image of Theo, who I'm pretty sure is well known through Nottingham for being able to kickflip over absolutely anything. He basically, this was his special trick, and I think it just shows an example of how personal expression can be done through skateboarding. Another point is it helps to develop a persistent and determined attitude which later can be injected into work life. This relates more so to the often repetitive and painful task of perfecting a skate trick, as well as just the general support system within the community, which is extremely strong, and I've observed it firsthand. In terms of the city, the regeneration of a city has a higher chance of success when developments are targeted to younger age groups. It brings life to unloved corners of cities, and prior to the removal of skate skaters from the park, which I think was down to maybe the marks that are often left on urban landscape due to skaters, which is sort of one of the main and only real reasons why, like, against some of my arguments. However, Philadelphia's John F. Kennedy Plaza showed that the presence of skaters reduced drug dealing and crime, going against all of the sort of stigma spoken about earlier, but it also brought tourism, as the iconic spot became an international symbol of youth and vitality for the state. So just to talk about something that is sort of going on now presently within Nottingham to help the community, Skate Nottingham is a non-for-profit organisation of whom have created a scheme that allows the local skate community to have a say in the designing of Nottingham's new skate-friendly public space located in Rushcliffe Country Park, Ruddington. Pretty sure this is actually due to be completed soon. But yeah, the scheme helps to inspire creativity and design in young skaters, including covering topics such as sustainability and construction. So after I'd done the bulk of my research, I was sort of left with questions and concerns from the community regarding what urban design had in store for maybe helping the community. And therefore I was lucky enough to conduct an interview with Chris Lawton from Skate Nottingham, who is also a senior lecturer at Nottingham Business School, where we sort of covered how this new skate-friendly public space would respond to some of these concerns, of which included gatekeeping, acknowledgement of beginners, representation, safety, and skater public interaction. I mean, I could literally talk about that all day, but one of the key points that I think is important to also know is that it's easy for me to say, oh, okay, urban design needs to do this, 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 and this, this. However, there are limitations in urban design. When I was speaking to Chris, he spoke of his worries of how the extent to which the local skate community would be able to sort of help within the design due to high powers such as local councils, etc. But other limitations also include acceptance from the public regarding issues such as litter, supervision, safety, and liability of damage and management of litigation. Finally, I just wanted to leave you on this image here that I took of two young boys who approached the Snenter Market Square. It's one of my favourites because it was so lovely. They sort of sat there wide-eyed, so just in awe of what was going on. I think it just shows what having skaters within urban settings can do for inspiring young people to then perhaps take on the project, that activity and sort of get involved and be a bit inspired. And then that also leaves me to sort of ask, when you, I suppose, next see skaters in urban settings, to just sort of initially analyse what you think, what is your opinion of the skaters, and then to question yourself, how heavily has my opinion of the community been influenced by wider views of society and representation in the media? Just, I suppose, as a sort of personal bit of research prior to the talk. But yeah, I think that is about it. Thank you for listening.
Olivia, thank you very much for this brilliant presentation. Perhaps we have time for a 10-minute Q&A, and then we hand over to Iain. How does that sound? And then we will have another time for another bit for a Q&A. Yeah.
That's
okay. Does anyone have any questions in the room that they want to ask?
Be nice.
I have a question. Really, like, just to kickstart, I guess, the conversation. You said something really interesting about the manipulation of space. Mm-hmm. When you were talking with the skaters, how they understand urban space as being something that can be manipulated and that is kind of in flux and that can change. And I was wondering, how would you think about bringing that knowledge to an architectural kind of understanding of urban space? Would it be possible to kind of invert the equation and, as you were proposing, learn from that manipulation of space and try to conceptualize space differently and therefore practice differently?
Yeah, 100%, definitely. I think, like, the main point of that, I suppose, sort of off topic, was just the fact that it really brings life to these parts of the city, and sort of and therefore I think that's something that perhaps can often be missed, is, oh, you think about how somebody moves throughout space, whatever, but you don't often think about how it's then, like, how do I put this? Viewed differently to how you would think it would be viewed. Because obviously there's a million different types of people in the world. Everybody views something differently, and being able to sort of, I think it's just that understanding that these spaces can be used in different ways, and therefore you could I don't really know what I'm saying at this point, but yeah.
Thank you so much. I think Iain has a question. Iain, maybe you can unmute yourself and ask it so everyone can see you.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me? Am I being heard? Yeah, hi Olivia, thanks for that presentation. That was fantastic. I think you've said quite a lot of what I was going to say in my presentation. I'll riff off some of the themes that you've already introduced. I'd be really interested to know, did you get a sense of any kind of shifting ground on the part of the public and some of the Nottingham kind of city folk? So, you know, Chris and what they've done with Skate Nottingham is absolutely amazing. And indeed, there's you could probably say that Nottingham's leading the way in Britain at the moment in terms of the kind of approaches that it's taking to public space, and it's through no small part through what Skate Nottingham and Chris and the other people are doing there, which is fantastic. Were you able to talk to anyone from the city or just wider public? Did you get a sense of things shifting away from this idea that, you know, all skateboarders are drop litter and smoke dope and make, you know, create disorder and are terrible for cities? Did you find that there was any shift away from that from outside of the skateboarding community?
Yeah, so there was a bit, obviously due to COVID, it was kind of a bit more difficult to do in-person interviews and stuff. But one of the things that I did note whilst I was there and observing the space was the fact that there wasn't much public interaction, to be honest, with the space. So I sort of did a bit of an online questionnaire just into sort of Facebook group chats of people who within like Centre Market, and just asking like, do the skaters prevent you from going to the space? Do you enjoy the skaters being there? Like, what is your opinion? Expecting people to be like, oh yeah, this isn't, yeah, we don't like them there, it's whatever. However, to be honest, nobody said that. People said that they really enjoyed, it was sort of like a point of entertainment. So there were quite, the people that I did observe were people that were sort of sat having their lunch and just like using the skaters as sort of like a form of entertainment, I guess. So from the small research that I can go off of, it seems that people aren't as negative towards the community as perhaps they used to be, or perhaps I thought they would have been. So yeah.
That's really interesting. There is some suggestion that people are indeed, in a way, funny way, more tolerant of skateboarders in public spaces, because we expect our public spaces to be kind of vibrant and contested and a bit noisy. And actually, maybe there's still some opposition occasionally towards skate parks, particularly when they're built near houses. There's a big legal battle going on in Swansea at the moment, or near Swansea at the Mumbles, around a new skate park that some folk with some very expensive houses nearby are trying to stop. And so you get that kind of NIMBYism around skate parks. But there does seem to be maybe a suggestion that in public space, a growing realization that skateboarding is more beneficial. That's really interesting to hear. I'll let someone else ask a question.
Yeah, well, just I suppose to add to that was just as I sort of illustrated one of those SCOB architects skate friendly public spaces. There was quite a lot of examples of which from other countries. I don't know whether there's just something in the UK where people just don't like skaters, but there were so many examples where they were sort of, people loved having them there. It's sort of become a bit of like a, as with the John F. Kennedy site, become like a symbol of youth and stuff like that. So I think it is, I don't know whether it is just that the UK is sort of behind with that, but hopefully there is sort of signs that it will improve.
Yeah, there's a few places around Britain where that's happening. I'll show a couple later. Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your questions. Can I ask if there's any final question that anyone wants to ask on the other end? Brilliant. So I want to thank you very much, Olivia, for your brilliant presentation. And now I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Kang, and his presentation today, his talk today is titled Seeing Heterotopia in the Art Audience Gallery Space. So I hand over to Kang, and yeah, thank you very much.
Hello, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Can everyone see?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. So yeah, my topic is seeing heterotopia in art. So in this presentation, I'll be talking about how to look at art and spaces in a heterotopia way. And I will share some of my visual drawings inspired by the research. So I will be aiming in the three main ideas in this research. It's heterotopia, white cube ideology, and also conceptual art. And first, I'm going to talk about heterotopia. And so heterotopia was mentioned by Michael Foucault. He proposed 6 principles from society, history, microcosm, time, space, and also illusion. But today I'm just going to aim for the 4 principles selected: microcosm, time, space, and also illusion. And so the first one I'll be talking about is microcosm. And he proposed an example of traditional Persian gardens are divided into 4 parts. Each represents the 4 elements which the world is composed. So basically, with this idea, everything could be seen as a really small world in every space or community or society. And with using this principle, we see this in gallery spaces as a small composition of the world. We could see the compositions of different society, environment, day and night, and event. And then heterotopia can also be a single cut of time. And Foucault, he took museums and libraries, for example, and he said it is a space that collects time, things of a period of time. And then the next one will be spaces. So heterotopia shows functions of opening and enclosure, blocking users from surrounding space. And Foucault took Islamic hammam as an example of space that people has the right of purification. So in the same theory, coming into gallery space, people must have an interest or purpose to enter the space. And next will be illusion. And heterotopia could turn illusion into reality. For example, Foucault took the 19th century great ships as a place of floating space. And the boat symbolizes the colony dreams in reality world. And then I'm going to talk about white cube ideology. And authority stated that modernism is closely related and framed by the space in this modern era. We would see the space first rather than seeing the art. So the experience of space can be more vital than the art itself. People may choose to interact or stay in the space more if the people has shown interest in the space atmosphere and will eventually connect more to the artwork. So nowadays, spaces no longer exist. Gallery spaces no longer exist as a single function. Gallery spaces show a mix of aesthetics and also commercial values in postmodern era. And then I'm going to talk about conceptual art. And George Dickey has mentioned that a work of art is viewed as someone who appreciates the work. So conceptual art can also be brought into the linking of art and audience when an artist creates conceptual art. So they have done all the decision making and planning before starting and making the art like a machine. Anish Kapoor states that there is something imminent in the work, but the cycle is only completed by the viewers. And I'm going to introduce 4 selected artists from my research and some visual studies inspired by their work and the theories mentioned before. So the first artist will be Urs Fischer, and then the next artist is Doho Su, and then Oliver Eliasson, and finally Liu Wei. And they all represent an area of space from individual cities to cross-country and to Mother Nature and finally to the universe. So the first artist is Urs Fischer. So I took his work Bliss. So you can see the white sculpture, the name it's called Bliss, as an example. So we can see the blank white sculpture has slowly changed through time with the audience, involving the procedure of making art from a really white surface to a fully decorated, colored sculpture. The intention of this art piece was to wishing audience to stick clay on the sculpture and wanting the audience to give contribution to the artwork. And according to Sol LeWitt's theory, when an artist creates conceptual art, they have done all the decision making and planning before starting and making art like a machine. So we can see Urs Fischer's work Bliss fully shown this theory from the entry of the gallery space to art and finally to the audience or participators. Every stage are fully considered beforehand. And the next artist he is a Korean artist called Do Ho-soo. And I'll take his work Seoul LA Home 1999 for example. So he used his memory to represent the back idea of installation, which is a single cut of time in heterotopia theories, bringing the illusion of his old Korean house to New York and wanting the audience to involve with his memories. So this reflects the illusion to reality principle in heterotopia. And this is an artwork and like a visual study I have created. So the concept study shows the process of Do Ho-soo bringing the Korean home idea from the right-hand side to the left-hand side. It's New York, and reflecting his character as an immigrant in the United States. And I'm going to talk about Oliver Eliasson. In 2001, Oliver Eliasson exhibited a project called the Mediated Emotion in Austria, and he used light, water, pressure, and temperature as his tool to create an urban nature environment. Every floor in the exhibition building acts like a natural environment for people to rethink the past memory that they have been to. And Eliasson describes the process of experiencing and sensing the surrounding as seeing yourself sensing. So this exhibition could be seen as a principle of closed space in heterotopia. Every space he created is an independent space with a different atmosphere and different spatial qualities for people to experience. And this is another visual study I have created. So you could see from the bottom, it's the swamp, and the middle one, it's mist, and the top one, it's desert. And finally, I'm going to talk about a Chinese artist called Liu Wei. And take his work Black Matter, for example. The black matter is inspired by the black hole not letting anything out. Even light cannot escape from gravity, and that a black hole creates. So Liu Wei wants the audience to abandon everything when entering a black hole, and a new world or universe is waiting at the other end. So through the observation from social medias, so through the pictures, we could see the result of people engaging the gallery space and the dark matter, seeing yourselves as a really tiny matter in this world, and reflects the size relationship between human and universe. And this observation looks back to the principle of microcosm in heterotopia. And this is another visual study I've created showing a dark hole removing the existing thought of an audience before entering the exhibition and using the artist's view to look at the art. And there's another art piece he created called Micro World Number 3. And it is a reflection of the smallest part of the world and cannot be seen with your eyes. The art sculpture is fully isolated from the outside world, which links to the principle of closed space. This sculpture represents a pathological section of human world, which is seen as a microcosm of the world. And according to the recorded images, people looked at the art piece, which shows the microcosm of the world, and the sculpture itself eventually shows a reflection of people seeing the world that they are living in, and at the same time influencing people's thought of seeing the world. And yeah, this is another art piece revealing the self-criticism of people seeing the society they are living and re-examining themselves. And the final piece is called 1098.1 Desert, and it is a really big block of sand representing Mother Earth and itself isolated from other art piece formed as a architecture sitting in the space. So this piece links to the principle of illusion, showing a symbolized piece wanting people to think back from seeing the very start of the universe and back to Earth, cherishing what we have for now and look towards the universe to gain more. This is my final visual study. So the research visual is showing the self-awareness of people seeing how small they are in the universe, but still seeing themselves wanting to explore the universe. And yeah, to sum up, we could use like these principles and different ways to look at spaces. So we could use principles to look at not only gallery spaces, but also space society around us and also in different countries or communities. Everything could be seen in like a heterotopia way and also even like in a conceptual art way. Thank you.
Brilliant. Iain, Kang, thank you so much for your brilliant presentation as well. We have seen a series of not only of very rich and thought-provoking presentations, but also incredibly rich visual imagery as well. And I think that all the presentations we've seen today, there's something very like key about the production of images. And maybe I wanted to kickstart this discussion with you and asking you about fiction and the creation of worlds, as you've been talking about. And I wanted to ask you about image making as a heterotopian practice. And I wanted to ask you if perhaps your what you call your visual studies or your research visuals or the images that you are creating, if we can think of them as heterotopian.
So you mean like how I create them or like the process of it?
Perhaps yes, also, but also what do you think the role of creating new images? What's the role of creating new images in relation to your own research as well? I'm fascinated by the way in which you use the images, basically.
Yeah, because for example, like if you look at spaces in a really heterotopia way, like dividing everything into the 6 principles, you will see a whole brand new space environment, also whole brand new like a spatial qualities, different from the ways if you don't use the 6 principles. So, for example, like creating the visual studies, I have created new pictures. So we are looking into the exhibition, the art spaces, and also the artwork itself, and also the audience. We're using the existing elements to create a new, to create like a new image, like by using the new 6 principles. And during the process of making the whole new images, I was thinking of adding lots of people movements in the drawings, showing a really big principle feature in Heterotopia, like a single cut of time. So you could see the drawings, they are like kind of blurry and moving around, and also combining lots of colors, but the colors each presents the elements of the existing spaces. Yeah, I don't know if this answers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, that's a brilliant answer. And it makes me think of Olivia's work as well, like the role of those images in helping you craft your research projects as well is quite key. And I think that there's something very interesting about the way in which you're all using the images and Harry's images as well, to not only to frame the research questions and to understand them, but also to produce possibilities, to imagine them very literally. I want to ask if there's any questions here in the room. Does anyone want to pose any questions? Anyone from the panel? Does any of the previous panelists, do you have any burning questions that you want to ask? Good, so I do have more questions, of course. If no one wants to ask them or is feeling shy, feel free to formulate them and then put them in the chat while I ask this. And maybe I wanted to ask you about the role of translating one space into another, and especially thinking about the heterotopia of illusion that you talked about. And I was quite taken by Doho Su's work, where he was bringing one place to another, and because that makes us really reconceptualize space. Absolutely. So I wanted to ask you about those translations. How do you understand heterotopias as expanding into space?
So maybe just take Doho Su's work, for example. So when I was looking at his work, he has like created tons of houses or even internal structures and lots of interior spaces, for example, bathroom, toilets, or like living rooms. And from the very early stage of his work, he took his idea of his like old memories from his childhood. So I was looking at the work he created that I showed, the LA Soul Home 999, and basically with a really heterotopia way, we could look at a section cut of time from his old memories. And I say he was like imagining if I could bring my Korean house to the United States and bringing it to be bring the illusion to reality. And before he created this artwork, he brought he created like a real Korean house in a New York apartment. So it is like a combination of two cultures in reality world. And then he used this idea to create another artwork, which is the artwork we showed on the presentation, the Seoul LA home as a illusion, and his imagination of bringing different elements, or maybe his homesick or like missing home ideas from Korea to New York. Yeah, and I say like if you look at he is really bringing the for example, if you look at the microcosm in the microcosm way, you could look at oh, it's so hard to explain. You could take his idea of the whole Korean culture. He looks at the whole Korean culture as a really small house, and bringing the whole Korean culture and his living environment to New York. So he's like compressing the big thing into like a really small thing and bringing the idea to New York and expand it big again. So it's kind of something like this. It's kind of hard to explain this abstract. Yeah, it's like really abstract.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We have maybe perhaps 5 minutes for a last question, if there's any burning question in the room.
Manuel, can I ask a question?
Of course, yeah.
It's for Will. So what was your methodology that you used for your research?
So due to COVID, I was planning to go to gallery spaces, but I can't. And so my methodology was using tons of Instagram pictures and also tons of virtual gallery pictures from the internet. And basically, I've kind of screenshot a lot of pictures from Instagram and showing different timelines and also different people reacting to the artwork or gallery spaces, because this is kind of like the only way to really kind of experience in the gallery itself. Yeah, so this is kind of my methodology.
Manuel, I think there is a question on the chat.
Perfect, great. So there's an anonymous attendant who's asking, would you consider showing your images, which look amazing, as artworks on their own right? That's an excellent question.
As artwork on the.
Do you want me to read it again?
Sorry, what does it mean?
So if you would consider showing your images as artworks on their own right.
Yeah. So you mean like I think it's like a my own artwork, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's because when I was creating these, I was thinking not only create a artwork, no, not really creating like a visual study, but actually create a new artwork based on the research artist, and also a kind of using my view and also using the research point of view of heterotopia, and also conceptual art views, and also the Y-cube ideology principles, or even the thoughts of the research, and also, yeah, like everything from the research. I was planning to use them as like a method of creating a new artwork from the research artist.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. I think that's we close with a great conclusion, with perhaps a speculative remark about image making and about heterotopias, and conceptual approaches to thinking about the interior and about architecture more broadly, and space and the production of space. So our next speaker is Professor Iain Borden, and we have slotted the presentation at 7 p.m. Would you think it would be a good idea to have a short break before we start? Or do you want to kick off and start? Yeah, just 10 minutes and we start at 7 for anyone who wants to pop in at that time, who hasn't been able to join us, to arrive, and so we keep on schedule. Yeah, so see you all in 10 minutes at 7 p.m. for Professor Iain Borden's lecture. I will introduce you at 7 p.m. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, and see you in a bit. Okay, thank you everyone. Hope you had a nice break. We'll give 1 more minute and then make a start. Great. Okay, hopefully everyone is back, and those who are going to join us are about to join. So I'm going to start by introducing Professor Iain Borden, who is our keynote speaker today. Professor Iain Borden, well, Iain Borden is Professor of Architecture and Urban Culture at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL, University College London, where he is also Vice Dean for Education for the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment, having previously been Vice Dean of Communications and Head of the Bartlett School of Architecture. He is a Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy and an Honorary Fellow of RIBA. His most recent book is Skateboarding and the City, A Complete History. His presentation is called Public Space, Community, and the Active Body, Skateboarding in the City. I hand over to you, Iain. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks, Manuel. Thank you. Thanks for the very kind invitation to speak at this event, and congratulations to the 3 speakers so far, to Harry and Olivia and Kang. I really enjoyed those presentations. Let me share my screen. Let me work out how to do this. Share content. So I want that one. Is that sharing? Is that okay? Is that working?
Yes.
And I will try to go. Is that still working? Yep.
No, it's not working now.
Okay. I'll leave it on.
Mm-hmm.
I'll leave it on that view. Is that okay? Is that big enough?
It's perfect, yeah.
Is that okay? Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much for the the invitation to speak. I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey. We're going to start with the chap on the left, who is Henri Lefebvre, who Harry mentioned in his presentation. We're going to go through a sort of history of skateboarding, particularly dealing with street skateboarding, which Olivia talked about in her talk in relation to the Nottingham skate scene. We're going to stop off at some different urban designs and skateboarding designs for skate parks and public spaces. And again, I'll be mentioning some of the things that Olivia mentioned. And we're going to end up in Afghanistan, in Kabul, for reasons that will become apparent when we get there. So let's start off with a little bit of theory. So Henri Lefebvre was a Marxist philosopher, French Marxist philosopher, alive through most of the 20th century. He wrote some 69 books in his life, but he's most well known in architecture circles for his work on the production of space, everyday life, and the politics of the city, the right to the city. Here we see Le Droit à la Ville. So I'm just going to give a very kind of brief introduction to Lefebvre's ideas of space, and then we'll get on to the skateboarding. And effectively, the idea that Lefebvre puts forward about space is that it's not a natural product, that it's not given to us by God. It doesn't pre-exist us. It is made by people. And hence the title of his best-known book, La Production de l'espace, translated into English as The Production of Space. And in that, Lefebvre says that space is made out of 3 different things, the first of which he calls spatial practices, but that we might think of as just being the things that we can see in the city. So in particular buildings, but any kind of object. And Lefebvre sometimes calls this, he calls it spatial practices, and he also calls it space as perceived. And by that, he doesn't mean the act of perception. He means the fact that we perceive space to be a set of objects. So this is Grand Central Station in New York. It's a building. It's a spatial practice. The second kind of way in which space is produced is Lefebvre calls representations of space, or space as conceived. And this is all the ways in which space is intellectually, consciously codified and thought by people. So architectural drawings, maps, sections, diagrams, but also mathematical equations, even music, any way in which people consciously try to conceive of space. So here we see Grand Central Station again, but this time located, you maybe can't see it, but it's right in the middle as part of the Greater New York Regional Rail map. So this is the same place, Grand Central Station in New York, but now viewed as a representation of space. And then the third area, or the third kind of spatial production that Lefebvre talks about, is spaces of representation, or space as lived. And this, by this he means all the ways in which space is experienced by people as they go about their lives, and particularly through their human body. And this is perhaps quite difficult to represent, because we experience space through our eyes, but also through our hearing, through our touch, through our sense of passive and unconscious ideas, and so on. So there's a kind of image of this on the screen. But then what Lefebvre says is that for space to be socially produced, it is produced by all 3 things together. So excuse my hackneyed layering of images here. So here we have Grand Central Station as an object, as a representation, and as an experience. And Lefebvre says that because of this, therefore, space is dynamic, it's historic, by which he means it's constantly changing. It's never the same, and indeed it's also contested. Different people will have different ideas and different uses of space. So space is a dynamic, active, social, conflicted, conflictual, negotiated, contested, unfolding entity. It's not simple, and therefore that we make space, but space in return makes us. And the late American geographer Ed Soja, after Lefebvre, called this the socio-spatial dialectic. We make space and space makes us. So very, very briefly, that's Lefebvre's notion of the production of space. But Lefebvre was also interested in the everyday and everyday life. And the everyday he saw as all that is routine, all that is boring, all that is regular and predictable. So, you know, these poor folks traipsing into work every day, they've got on the same, pre-COVID, same commuter train, they've eaten the same breakfast, they're bored, they don't, you know, they're bored with life, they go to the same job, they're bored with their partner, they have nothing stimulating in their life, and that's the everyday. But Lefebvre also talks about everyday life, and these are people who, you know, love their partner, love their job, love their work, have different experience every day, are politically active, are creative, they're engaged, embodied, are dynamic, and are fulfilled in the way that they go about their lives. And Lefebvre says that it's at the level of the everyday that things really matter. So it doesn't really matter if there's a war, or if there's a pandemic, or if there's Manchester City do or do not win the European Cup final. They're important, of course they're incredibly important, well, at least the first two of them are, but that what really matters is the effect of this on people's everyday lives. That politics is ultimately resolved, things that are important are ultimately resolved in the quality of life that we have in our daily practices, and that it's there, and indeed on kind of normal city streets, that we should look for a politics of space, a politics of life, and a politics of architecture. So I started off working on Lefebvre's thought, or I was first exposed to Lefebvre's thought by actually Ed Soja, the American geographer that I mentioned, back in the 1980s. And I was trying to think of a way to explore Lefebvre's ideas through architecture. So for me, my interest in skateboarding is partly personal. You know, I skateboard myself and have done for 40 odd years. But academically, I was also looking for a vehicle, if you'll pardon the pun, by which to explore Lefebvrean ideas. So my ideas, my research on skateboarding, at least to begin with, when I first started doing it in, well, very late 80s and into the 90s, was a kind of Lefebvrean interpretation. It's moved slightly away from that for reasons that will become clear. So quick history about skateboarding. It starts in the late 1950s, early 1960s with scooters, and then with some pretty primitive skateboard devices. And then in the 1970s, it's particularly associated with surfing, and indeed riders on skateboards deliberately emulate surfers. So you can see through this comparison of images here that the skater at the bottom is trying to do the kind of cut back on a wave that a surfer would do. And in doing so, something very profound happens. This is a schoolyard bank in Los Angeles, and it's made out of asphalt, tarmac. But through the skateboarder's action, that is no longer a piece of tarmac in a schoolyard. It has become imaginatively a wave. So what was an object as a spatial practice, a tarmac bank, has now, through a conscious imagination of surfing and through the skateboarder's own experience, through the act of skateboarding, architecture has been changed. This is no longer tarmac. This is both tarmac and a kind of watery wave and something else. And this is a very profound kind of rethinking of what architecture is, that it changes when people experience it in a different way. Also, so we're still in the 1970s, skateboarders started to find some more dramatic places to skate. They found some big pipes out in the Arizona desert. I think Olivia showed a kind of drawing representation of these. They also found that if you got hold of a swimming pool and found one that was curved in section and took the water out, you could ride up the sides and up onto the walls. This is a famous pool known as the Dog Bowl, after some of its doggy local residents. Again, we're kind of 1976, 1977 here. And then what happened, you sort of 76, 77, but particularly 78, you get the first big spectacular concrete skate parks being built. And this is one called Pipeline, named after a famous surfing location in Hawaii. But as you can see here, it's replicated the pipes that you can see in the top image, and the image at the bottom is a kind of an extreme swimming pool with blue tiles and coping. So it's taking the architectures that were found out in the landscape, but now extrematizing them and making them suitable for skateboarding. And just to show you that there were hundreds, thousands of these built all over the world, including around 100 of them in the UK. And I couldn't resist putting in a couple of images of the Malibu Dog Bowl. So Malibu, named after Californian surfing location. Dog Bowl, named after the swimming pool that I showed you, but actually a converted cinema in Nottingham. And you can see on this image, this is the opening night of the Malibu Dog Bowl in Nottingham in 1978. So about 100 of these get built in the UK, thousands all over the world. Most of them are commercial, pay to enter facilities. What else do we have? Different kinds of terrains, wooden ramps, some very spectacular loops, not very common. More common are these wooden half pipes that you see at the bottom. And Lefebvre talks a lot about the bodily centric production of space. And one of the things I became very interested in skateboarding is how space is produced from the skateboarder's body, the board, and the specialist terrain, the skate park beneath them. And this is a kind of performed space that it really kind of only exists when those three things come together. So architecture as object, but also then through the dynamic performing body with this particular, actually quite simple tool of the skateboard. And it's a kind of like a poetic declaration or performance of space. So then we, for various reasons to do with commercial failure, a kind of overproduction of skateboards, some problems with insurance, some problems with just redevelopment of land, most of these skate parks, nearly all of these skate parks that were built in the 1970s die a commercial death, and most of them are destroyed. These are two in Nebworth in Hertfordshire, and a skate park in Chester called Inner City Truckers being destroyed in the early 1980s. But skateboarding doesn't die, it finds new places to happen. And in particular, what skaters realised through the 1980s, but particularly in the 1990s, is you don't need a skate park. That actually the everyday architecture of the city street is perfect skateboarding terrain, or can be rethought as skateboarding terrain. So you don't need a swimming pool, you don't need a pipe, you don't need extreme, $100,000, multi-100,000 skate parks to skate. What you need is some steps, or some rails, or some ledges, or just a bit of tarmac. And I'm going to show you a first video clip here, and hopefully the sound will come through as well. And this is of a skater called Zered Bassett skating through the streets of New York in 2014. Okay, he's quite good. Did the sound play there? Was the sound playing? Yeah, good. Okay, that's brilliant. So what's going on here? Well, one of the most obvious things is that it's the everyday terrain of the city, which is now the skate park, as it were. But one of the things that I also became very interested in through Lefebvre's notion of the everyday and politics was the idea that through the actual act of skateboarding, So not through text, not through words, not through any kind of codified enunciation, but particularly through the performed act. I called it performative critique. Through the performative critique of the skateboarder, something was being said about the city and about urban space. Some kind of critical voice was being made. So that raises the question, well, what's the critique of? Well, one thing is the critique of the body. So Harry talked a little bit earlier about consumerism and the way that, and one of the things that people often talk about with consumerism is the way that the body is reduced to a pretty simple kind of consuming machine, where we either consume with our mouths or we consume particularly with our eyes, and that the body becomes very passive. If you think about walking through a shopping mall, you're just walking at a steady pace, you're consuming with your eyes and you're consuming with your wallet. And what skateboarding does, it's not the only thing that does this, but it re-enunciates what Lefebvre calls a fleshy body, a body which is thinking, but is touching, seeing, balancing, muscular, full of energy. And this is sort of part of Lefebvre's idea that space in particular is performed outwards from the human body, but also then that the body itself is somehow changed in that active engagement with the world around it. So a different kind of body is being produced through this, but a different kind of architectural engagement is being produced because, in this case, the skater is literally touching the wall that they're riding on. The second critique is a critique of what makes great, a critique of architecture. So the image on the left is of a simple brick bank in Sacramento, and this was published, I think, as a full-page picture in the skateboard magazine called Thrasher, as an example of great skateboarding architecture. And the idea wasn't that you should get on a plane and fly to Sacramento and go to this bank, although you might choose to do this, but rather if you put the magazine down or turned the TV off and went outside, almost certainly you too could find great architecture very close to where you are. Now, of course, this depends on what criteria you use to define great architecture. If you mean something by Zaha Hadid or Frank Gehry or or Le Corbusier or any other famous architect, this ain't it. If you mean something that has a kind of high technological or theorization behind it, this ain't it. But it is great architecture if you judge something according to, is it good architecture to skate? So the skater you see on the right, this is a picture from Riga, Latvia, is not interested in the Soviet era monument or architecture behind them, but is interested in the precise space and gap and angle of the surfaces that they're transferring across. So there's a critique here of how we value architecture, and in particular it suggests that the values that architects and designers use are not always the values that people who are not built environment professionals use when assessing what makes good architecture. And I think that's a sort of an important lesson for all of us who are on the sort of professional academic side of skateboarding to think of architecture, to think about, that our agendas, our criteria are not necessarily the ones that people who are not in the world of architecture with a capital A might think of. What else is going on here? Well, there's a critique of production and consumption. Very often urban spaces seem to be important for its function in terms of production. How do we make things? How do we produce things? And in particular, how do we consume things? And that a public space is therefore to be used by office workers or shoppers. But skateboarding suggests a different kind of consumption of space. It suggests that without paying to use it, that space can be dynamically and usefully used. So it's a kind of reassertion of use values over exchange values. Another aspect of this, and Olivia, one of many things that Olivia brought up in her talk, alluded to as well, is who has the right to the city. And very often, particularly younger people or people that seem to be doing unusual things are sort of considered to be lower down the list of somehow people who have the right to access the city. But one of the important things that Lefebvre says about the right to the city is it's not just about access. The right to the city is not just to have the right to skate on the streets. We're back in New York here. But the right to the city is the right to become, is the right to develop yourself and be the kind of person that you identify with and that others like you identify with. It's the right to be different, and it's the right to develop, and it's the right to change, and it's the right to be mobile. It's the right to have an identity. And skateboarding, I think, is one of those activities that asserts that right, not just to access, but to have potentially a different kind of identity in the city. Because of this, therefore, skateboarding's often encountered resistance from city authorities. So you get anti-skateboarding devices around cities, and sometimes you get people get fined and excluded from the city in a way that perhaps similar to the homeless. And because of this, particularly in the 1990s, skateboarding developed a sort of self-ideology as an oppositional subculture, a subculture that somehow was defiant, was aggressively confronting mainstream society. Skate and destroy was one of the big kind of slogans or mantras of skateboarding. You know, you either skated or you were stupid. You were either a kind of switched on oppositional subcultural skateboarder, or you were an unthinking lackey of capitalism. And also, I think the other thing that was pretty strong in the 1990s was the idea that most skateboarders were male, and that the masculinity was framed around transgression, danger, risk-taking, getting bloodied and battered while skateboarding. So I've written 2 books about skateboarding. The first one came out in 2001, which you see on the left, Skateboarding, Space in the City, and kind of everything that I've said so far is in that book. A couple of years ago, I completely and totally rewrote it and updated it as Skateboarding and the City, so a sort of the same but different title. And everything that I'm going to say in the next 10 minutes or so is what's different about the second book to the first book, if that makes sense. Oh, keep pressing the wrong button now. Okay, so what's changed? Well, skateboarders themselves have changed. So they're much less likely to only be teenage white male skaters, which was kind of a stereotype, but kind of also true of the 1990s. So in this picture, there are graphic designers, an accountant, a police officer, who else can I see? A corporate lawyer, and somebody who is unemployed through largely through mental health issues. And these are all people who are regular skateboarders. So skateboarders themselves have become increasingly diverse, and they're of different sexualities. This is not to say there are no problems with homophobia or sexism in skateboarding. Of course there are, but nonetheless, skateboarding's trajectory has been to move away from the idea that everyone is a white, heterosexual, male, transgressive street skater. And consequently, they have different bodies. So they can be old, they can be white, they can be black, they can be brown, they can be young, they can be old, They can also have disabled bodies. They can be in a wheelchair. They can have no legs, which is the skater you see on the bottom right, who is a professional skateboarder, but a double amputee. What else has happened? Well, we've seen the return of skate parks increasingly through the 2000s, particularly over the last 10 years. Municipal councils and charities have realised that skate parks and skateboarding is a good way to engage with youth and with other people who are looking for well-being, places for well-being. And these tend to be, not always, but they tend to be free access rather than the commercial facilities that existed in the 1970s. And I just want to show you some examples of these. So some of them are very small. This is one, I'm in Southeast London at the moment. This is a skate park that was just converted from an old paddling pool, cost £50,000. It was one of the skate parks that I've been involved in. They're not really big things. They're just sort of adapted from existing architecture. Some are put into otherwise unused urban space. This is one built beneath an overpass in Moscow. Some are incredibly elaborate and very expensive. This is one built next to a UNESCO protected, I think it's 16th century fortress site in Luxembourg, with some very beautiful uses of concrete and quite elaborate shapes and molds. Some work with artists. This is a skate park in Vassivière in France with the artist Ku Yong-ah, and it's made with a special kind of impregnated concrete which glows in the dark. So as you can see here. But what's also been happening is that there are skate parks which aren't really, they're not really based on the swimming pools and bowls of traditional skate parks. And this is one that I was peripherally involved with in Milton Keynes, called the Buzzy, which wasn't designed to look like a skate park at all. It was meant to be similar to that kind of everyday urban terrain. So really it's just some ledges and some steps and some sloping ledges that skateboarders might find elsewhere in the city. And it's a kind of stealth skateboarding park, if you like. And this kind of model has been quite influential. So this is a park in Philadelphia. It's meant for skateboarders, but it's also meant for other people to sit and eat their lunch and watch and converse and do all the other things that you do in an urban park. So it's if you like, a skatable space, a public space which happens to be good for skateboarding rather than something which is designed only as a skate park. Other things that people have tried to do, it is a skate park, but it's got some basketball and it's got barbecue pits and it's got a sand pit, and it's not just a lump of concrete. This is in Lemvig in Denmark. Other skate parks have introduced other activities like BMX and climbing. This is Transition Extreme in Aberdeen. Some have just gone full on with the beautiful architecture. This is the skate hall in Oslo. Beautiful building, but also one where they've worked with the forms of the skateboarding terrain. So bottom right is the underside of the skateboard bowl. So you walk in at ground level and you see this amazing kind of sculptural object. It reminds me of some of the things that Kang was showing in his talk. It's a kind of sculptural art installation itself, but one that then you can go up and actually skate in. This is a project being built in Folkestone that I've also been involved in. This is the world's first ever purpose-built multi-story skate park. So the image I show at the bottom with this pool bowl is at first floor level. So when you walk, it's not quite finished, it'll be finished in this summer. But when you walk in, you walk a bit like the picture I just showed you at the skate hall, you walk in underneath the concrete forms of this skate bowl. And then there are other layers up above that different things happen on. This skate park is costing 12-13 million pounds to build, and it's part of an urban regeneration of a kind of creative quarter of Folkestone on the southeast coast of England. Other kinds of things that have taken place, you obviously then still have commercial but branded skate parks. This is the House of Vans, the Vans shoe company in London. So it's a skate park, but it's also a gallery, it's also a film venue, and everything in this skate park is free to go in. It's free to go to a film, it's free to go to a gig, it's free to skate park. They give lessons on a Sunday morning, it's free. The only thing you have to pay for is the beers and the Coke and burgers if you want something to eat or drink. And it's a kind of rolling advert for the Vans shoe company. Other people have also started doing this. So Hard Rock Cafe has some branded hotels, and you can now go to a 5-star hotel in Mexico and have gourmet food, but spend the day at a skate park as part of the hotel. Slightly differently, I think it's worth pointing out that skateboarding has started to challenge at an urban level how we value our public places. So I won't go into this, there's a very long story here, but this is the Undercroft underneath the South Bank Arts Centre in London. Skateboarders have been skating there for 40 odd years, since the early 1970s. There was an attempt to move the skateboarders out from here. They managed to get 140,000 people to sign a petition to keep skateboarding there. So signed by a lot of people who are not skateboarders, and through various political pressures, the skateboarding has now been permanently featured and fixed in that site. We've now started to see some skateboarding sites being grade heritage listed. So this is one of the very few surviving skate parks from the early 1970s. This is Rom Skate Park in Hornchurch in Essex. Built in 1978, it's still there. There's just been a film called Rom Boys, 40 Years of Rad, which you can watch on Amazon Prime and iTunes and so on. And that was grade 2 listed by English Heritage. And there are also other places that are trying to develop this idea of public spaces which are good to skate. So this is Landhausplatz in Innsbruck, in the centre of Innsbruck in Austria. These are water plazas or Bentheimplan in Rotterdam. And this is a plaza which has multi-uses, including flooding with water when it needs to, but is also good to skate when it's dry and in between other activities and other times as well. And my own university, University College London, we're just developing a new campus on the Olympic Park site in the east of London. And as part of that, one of the things we're doing, we've got a group called City Mill Skate, who are actively working with local youth and other riders as to how we can make the spaces between the buildings on this campus, how we can make them good to skate. So the skateboarders there will not be excluded, they would be welcomed onto the site. And this is a way that my university, University College London, is trying to bring in diverse publics into its campus. So it's not a kind of walled off fortress in that part of London. What else is changing? Skateboarding is going to be in the Olympics, in the Tokyo Olympics later this year, presuming it takes place. So we're going to have skateboarding on a truly international stage for the first time. And we're already seeing how that's having a big impact on female skaters, because men and females competitions will be given equal billing in this. And this is already having an impact in skate parks around the country. We're seeing a lot more female skaters of all ages taking up skateboarding. Other things to note, skateboarding of course is big business. Every single one of the brands you see on the screen here is associated with skateboarding. Just to pick one, I've already mentioned them, Vans at the bottom. The Vans turn over $2.5 billion a year. They're owned by VF Corp, a venture capitalist firm. They're VF Corp's biggest brand. But some of these brands are very small, and so there's an awful lot of entrepreneurialism and commercial activity associated with skateboarding. There's a lot of creativity, so outsider artists like Hiroshi, really famous video artists like Sean Gradwell, famous graphic artists like James Jarvis, kind of street associated artists like D-Face, have all in some way grown out of the skateboard scene. And just coming towards the end here, just to say that skateboarding, though, if it can be commercial, it can be big business, but it also continues to be very local and community oriented. So this is DIY skate park construction, where skateboarders themselves build their own skate parks, sometimes with permission, sometimes not, sometimes with borrowed equipment, sometimes with slightly dodgy equipment where they got it from, but normally through some kind of negotiated community project, taking over some wasteland or land that's not being used and building something which is often quite simple, but nonetheless quite challenging to ride. So that's a big part of the skateboard scene at the moment. And then finally, my last point is around the way in which skateboarding has started to reach outside of itself into different social enterprises, and particularly the idea that skateboarding is a way to connect with, reach to, empower people who perhaps some of whom are amongst the most disempowered in our cities today. And there are projects all over the world that do this, and sometimes they're kind of quite formal. This is Skate Pass, a group that works to go into schools and use skateboarding as a kind of alternative physical education to get people, maybe you're not interested in team sports or soccer or those kind of highly regulated sport, but skateboarding nonetheless is something that you can pick up and do on your own terms. And it's trying to kind of expand the idea of what we understand by sport. There are also places like the FAR Academy in the UK or Bryggeriet in Sweden, which are whole secondary schools predicated around skateboarding. So they have a whole kind of high school, secondary school agenda, but they frame it in relation to skateboarding. I'm a trustee of the FAR Academy, and they do particular work with kids who perhaps normal schools don't kind of quite work for them. So they have a lot of school kids who have got mental health issues or have got quite difficult social backgrounds, and they use skateboarding as a way to keep them in school and to enliven them. But probably best known, and my last example before I stop, is a group called Skatistan, who are a skate-related charity operating in Kabul in Afghanistan. They've been operating now for about 15 years, and they use skateboarding as a tool of empowerment. I don't know how much you can read this, but they use it to get some quite challenged kids off the streets and to give them new skills and a sense of identity and power. And I'm just going to finish on a short video that explains a little bit more of what Skatistan do. Oh, sorry. Can't do that.
Children make up 70% of the population of Afghanistan. kids often only have, you know, roadsides that are filled with rubbish and cars, and there's no place for them in the society here. So the result is they tend to grow up very quickly.
Girls aren't allowed to ride bicycles here, they're not allowed to climb over fences.
We had to teach the boys that no, they couldn't push the girls off the board, and they had equal rights to be in that particular space.
To become a good skateboarder, you just have to lose your fear, and they don't have any fear in the first place. What Skaterstand is about is engaging kids through skateboarding and then giving them other skills. If kids grow up with guns and that's all that they know, then they're going to use guns later on, or they're going to use violence to solve problems. For us, it's more about breaking the cycle of violence.
We found skateboarding to be such a fantastic tool for communication. We get kids from all sorts of ethnicities building relationships with each other. So we've got Hazara kids skateboarding with Tajik kids, and we've also got girls skateboarding as well. People in other countries can see that these kids don't all want to strap explosives to themselves, and they're actually kids, and I think skateboarding's given them a little bit of confidence. We want them to be problem solvers, to be part of the reconstruction of their country. We want them to have a voice.
And that brings me to the end of this. So we've done our journey. We've started with an idea about the production of space and the body-centric of space and the importance of the everyday. And I hope to have shown you how some of that can be played out through the act of skateboarding, particularly in city streets, and how it can end up having some quite a powerful effect in some of the most challenging places in the world, or just around the corner from wherever we all live in the world. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this brilliant talk and for the super rich condensation of very wide-ranging type of work, and that encompasses not only theoretical engagement but also architectural practice and a way of bridging those two things together. It seems like Harry has a burning question here. I wanted to ask something, but I think that no, is it? So shall I ask the question first, or does anyone have a quick question, burning question in the Q&A? Perhaps I can kickstart the conversation with a broad perhaps question about the critique of production and consumption, taking a bit of a cue from Lefebvre and thinking about how this is playing out in relation to gentrification. I'm thinking here about Olivia's presentation as well. For instance, in the Snainton market and the F51 Folkestone project, which can become kind of part of real estate speculation in a sense. So I wanted to ask you, how should we think about this paradoxical integration into the capitalist cycle of something that was countercultural and then perhaps has become slightly integrated into the whole reproduction of capitalism, and how can we think about the critique of production and consumption in relation to the right to the city?
Yeah, no, that's a really fantastic question, Manuel, and it's incredibly complicated in skateboarding. I mean, the first thing I would say is that skateboarding's ideology in the 1990s was that it was countercultural, almost anti-capitalist, certainly subcultural, and the skateboarding discourse around that time, particularly through Thrasher Skateboarding magazine, and there are only two of us academics working on it through the 90s, myself and a sociologist called Becky Beale, and that we both, or particularly myself, kind of, I think, promoted that idea academically that skateboarding was, was countercultural and so forth. One of the things that I think on reflection I got wrong was to emphasize that too much. I was talking to Teal Triggs, who I work with at the Royal College of Art a little bit, and she's done a lot of work on punk, and I asked her, how much do you think punk music in the 70s, when was it truly countercultural? And she said, well, for about 5 minutes. and sometimes I wonder if that's true of skateboarding as well, because the moment you start to locate it in circuits of capital, in terms of teams, in terms of money, in terms of videos, in terms of DVDs, in terms of spectacularization, but also once you start to realize that, and there have been quite a few critiques of white male skateboarding in the 90s, seeing themselves as victims, that actually, of course, those white skaters didn't experience anything like the kind of repression or disempowerment or disenfranchisement that skaters of colour or non-skaters of colour or women or black folk or brown folk encountered in the 1990s. So was it ever really transgressive, or was it just an ideology of transgression? So that's one difficult thing about it. So one of the things I've tried to do in my later work is just to unpack that a little bit more and show that it's more complicated than it was countercultural and now it's been adopted by the mainstream. Your other point, which I think was really important, is that, of course, what happens is when everyone uses urban space and adopts urban space in a new way, there is a danger that they can act often unwittingly as the shock troops of gentrification. And an American historian and theorist, Ocean Howell, has talked about this in relation to skate parks. And it can occur in two different ways, one of which is that weirdly, the sort of self-contained, independent rhetoric of skateboarding, you know, I don't need the state, I don't need a skate park, I can just go out and use the city street, I break my leg, I don't need to go to hospital, I can fix that myself, you know, sod the world, I'm an independent island. That aligns very neatly with neoliberal market politics, which is that you shouldn't rely on the state, everyone should be their own kind of sole trader, you should be flexible, you should adapt to the world around you, don't rely on anyone other than yourself. But the other bit of it is that there, of course, there are examples that you know, in the same way that artists occupy kind of run down bits of town, and then you know, and then the academics and the architects and the designers move in, and then the bankers move in, and then it's been gentrified. The same thing does happen with skateboarding, that sometimes skateboarders help to gentrify a neighborhood. And probably the most famous DIY skate park is something called Burnside in Portland in Oregon, and exactly that has happened there. They took over an area underneath a bridge. It was sort of disused. It was used mainly for sex workers and drug taking. It was a pretty dangerous bit of the city, but they built their own skate park there, and long story short, they've helped to gentrify the area to the point whereby there are now new kind of condominium apartments going up next to the skate park, and there's a worry that those condo owners will try and get the skate park removed and the skaters will be kicked out. So yes, skateboarders can unwittingly act as part of gentrification as well, and I think that's something that you know, people need to be aware of, at least conscious of, even if they can't control, when they're building a DIY spot. You know, what are you starting here? It's a conundrum.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I want to ask if there's any other question around in the room.
I have one, but I think maybe Doug's got a question in the comments there as well, Manuel. Maybe might be best dealing with his first, actually.
Okay, so I'm going to read it. It says, historically, there seems to be a connection between an architecture of the margins and the marginal behavior of the skater. Do you think there is some mileage in this connection, or is it more incidental? That is, that particular architectures are simply more conclusive to skating, i.e., like the famous space on the South Bank you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I used to say, if you ever wanted to find skateboarders in the city and you're in a capital city, go to the National Theatre or go to the Arts Complex. So I think there are certain things about skateboarding sites that you know, of course they vary. but skateboarders like to be seen often, but not to be like, you know, performing penguins in the zoo. So you often find skateboarders in places that are near to but marginal to city centres and that are not too crowded. You know, skateboarders don't want to get in the way of other people because they don't want other people to get in their way either. So somewhere like the South Bank, which is people that don't know, I did show a picture of it, is a sort of underbelly of the Purcell Rooms and the Queen Elizabeth Hall on the South Bank complex. That's perfect in a way because it's undercover, it's out of the way, but it's in the centre of town. You can be seen, but you're not too much on display, although sometimes it feels a little bit like you're in a zoo there. So yes, skateboarders do often take those sort of slightly marginal spaces, but they do so for good reasons. You know, they take them because no one else is there. And because they're not going to get in anyone else's way. So it's often, yeah, underneath a freeway, underneath a bridge, but maybe round the back of a building. Maybe it's a disused industrial site, that kind of thing. There aren't many examples there are some, but there aren't many examples of skateboard spaces that are wholly secret or wholly tucked away. You know, as I say, skateboarding's about the right to become in the city, and a lot of skateboarding is about people in a way learning how to negotiate with urban space and how to become an urban citizen when they're a teenager or close to. And so, you know, that's what attracts you to those spaces. It's where can you go, particularly if you don't have lots of money, that enables you to participate in the city and to start to become an independent urban person. So I think it's those kinds of spaces that attract you, and you know, being hidden away from all your fellow urban citizens doesn't really do that.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe we can ask Harry to.
Yeah, thanks, Iain. Yeah, really great talk. Yeah, I suppose I was going to pick up on something that maybe you addressed in the first answer to Manuel's question about kind of issues to do with, you know, branding and having to kind of pay to use sites and things like that. So the idea that, you know, companies will start to attach themselves and latch on to, you know, kind of counterculture types of activities like skateboarding. But I suppose one of the other questions I was going to ask is probably a simpler question, but I was just going to be, what's the kind of response generally, would you say, from working on some of the kind of skate parks in the UK here? What's the response from architectural designers, you know, being involved in these projects? You know, is it something that they enjoy, or are they kind of maybe a little bit kind of like, well, you know, I'm not really sure about this, don't know too much about it, you know? So I just wonder what their response is like.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say most skate parks are designed and built by professional skate park builders. They, you know, so it is that there is a certain, it's not hugely technical, but there's a certain specific know-how about how you build a skate park, both in terms of, you know, physically how you make those curves and forms, but also in the design of them and what makes a skate park good to skate. And they often have people who are skateboarders as part of the design team doing it. There aren't many examples of kind of collaborations between architects and skate park designers. The project at Folkestone that I showed you, the architect for the building is Guy Holloway Architects, who are kind of good modernist designers, if you like. But the riding surfaces are designed by, the concrete surfaces are designed by a company called Maverick. And I was involved for about a day as a consultant, just to sort of give the client some assurance that what was being designed was kind of useful. But I think the more interesting things is where you see architects working in public places that are kind of good to skate. So the Paynes Park that I showed you in Philadelphia, that was designed by an architect called Anthony Brackley, And similarly, the Innsbruck, the Landhausplatz scheme was designed by a local architecture firm, and they might have people on the team who happen to be skaters. I'd have to say that there's a couple of other projects that I'm not allowed to mention, sorry, but there's one other project that I'm involved in the UK that where there's an architect involved, but they're making sure that they have specialist experts involved. But the architects are very interested. They're very interested in doing things of this kind of skatable space stuff. Is real of interest to architects and designers, are very free thinking and open-minded towards that. The barriers tend to come from city officials or property developers who are worried about health and safety, property values and so on. That if there's a blockage in that system, as it were, it's in it comes from there rather than from designers. So some of the work that Skateboard GB is doing, and I've done a little bit with them, and Chris Lawton, who Olivia mentioned, he's now left his job at Nottingham at University and has gone to work full time at Skateboard GB. Are doing is to promote this idea of the skateboardable space and not just skate parks. One of the things that people are worried about in design terms, and particularly with the Tokyo Olympics, is that everyone will think, oh, that's great, skateboarding's like a sport. We just need to build lots of these skateboard park things. And skate parks are great. I love them. They're where I ride, but they're not the only place for skateboarding. It would be like trying to, only cycle in a velodrome. You have to be able to cycle everywhere. And you should be able to skateboard everywhere, and that's the challenge: is how to build those kind of skatable spaces. And the architects are basically up for it.
Oh, great, thanks.
There's one last question in the chat from Sam, and I'm going to read it. It says, "Thank you for the very informed and cool talk, Iain. With the critique of architecture, there is imbued potential for the space to skate. The potential is then dramatically reduced with anti-skate devices and transgressive culture. Does it also reduce with the age of the litigious action, i.e. the responsibility of health and safety lies ultimately with someone, and local authorities or organizations are at greater risk to provide the potential?" And as a parenthesis, he says, "Please, sorry for the very stuffy question."
Yeah. It's really interesting, and actually the legal aspects of skateboarding are kind of fascinating. So when I said that that first wave of skate parks closed down in America, a lot of them closed down because they couldn't insure themselves. They couldn't get any insurance, and little Johnny or little Chicasta would break their wrist, and the parents would come after the skate park for $1 million. Or whatever, but certainly in some of them just did some very sort of legally dodgy things where you had to sign a waiver to do it, and they certainly had big litigious problems. And that's certainly one of the things that people say when you go and say, well, wouldn't it be great if we had skateboarding in our multi-purpose skatable public space urban square venue thing, and people say, well, think about, who's going to get sued? Well, it can be a problem, and it can not be a problem. But what's interesting, I think, is that people are generally now seeing a bigger appetite for risk and for the necessity of risk, and for the necessity actually that risks are kind of good because they challenge people, and that we don't all want to be wrapped in cotton wool at every time. So one of the ways that California dealt with this was they legally declared skateboarding to be a dangerous activity. And the moment, this is American law, because you declare it to be dangerous, that means that anybody that engages in it does so at their own risk. So you can't sue someone for allowing you to engage in a dangerous activity. And that was quite a use. Now, admittedly, that was the Californian solution. In different American states and in different countries had different ways of doing it. But that was quite an interesting way of dealing with it. And it certainly allowed for many new skate parks to open, because effectively they couldn't be sued, because it's like, well, you know, it's dangerous. You shouldn't be engaging in it anyway. Now, obviously, if somebody builds something which is, you know, the ramp falls apart while you're on it, or the concrete cracks apart, or they, you know, leave broken glass in the bottom of the bowl, then yeah, that's a different matter. But through the simple act of somebody being allowed to skate, shouldn't be, you know, necessarily be dangerous. And we're seeing a lot of appetite from parents, you know, who are, you know, they say, well, is skateboarding dangerous? And you say, well, you know, your daughter, if she skates, she'll probably break her wrist. Yeah, you know, that's probably going to happen at some point in the next 4, 5, 6 years. But what won't happen is that they won't have a life-changing injury. You know, skateboarding actually has very low incidences of life-changing injuries. So unlike rugby or horse riding or scuba diving, or indeed football or baseball or basketball, people don't die, or they don't, you know, break their neck and have some, you know, nerve damage through skateboarding. You break your wrist, there's a broken wrist. You can break your leg, but that's about it. Unless, of course, you skate in the street and have an argument with a car, in which case you're going to lose quite badly. But, you know, on public plazas or skate parks, it's fine. It's minor, relatively minor stuff that will happen.
Great, thank you very much. I think that's a brilliant way of giving, you know, coming to a close in the session. And yeah, I wanted just to give a few very quick final remarks. I wanted to remind everyone who is still around here that we have another session tomorrow, and we're going to have Douglas Gittins, Saskia Warnes, Lily Riley, and Professor Carolina Rito speaking tomorrow. So I invite you to join us tomorrow as well. I want to thank the speakers today. I want to thank Harry, Olivia, Iain, Kang, Iain, for your brilliant talks and for your, you know, brilliant engagement. And I also want to thank everyone who's been, you know, behind the curtains or on the other side of the screen, Nico and Ben, and of course Harry, for organizing everything. And yeah, thank you very much. I want to wish you a lovely evening and see you all tomorrow. Thank you very much.